Good evening, everyone. I'm Joanna Pruka, President of the Santa Fe Conservation Trust Board of Directors. Tonight, it's my great pleasure to introduce our conservation conversation with author and conservationist Terry Tempest Williams and New Mexico's own Senator Tom Udall. Terry Tempest Williams is an award-winning and best-selling author, conservationist, and activist. Her writing is rooted in the American West and has been significantly influenced by the arid landscape of her native Utah and its Mormon culture. Her work ranges from issues on ecology and wilderness preservation, to women's health, to exploring our relationship to culture and nature. Currently, she was writer in residence at the Harvard Divinity School. Since his first election to Congress in 1988, Senator Tom Udall has been a leader on a wide array of environmental issues. Most recently, he co-sponsored the 30 by 30 resolution to save nature, with the goal of conserving at least 30% of the land and 30% of the ocean within the territory of the United States by 2030. His father, Stuart Udall, was Secretary of the Interior under both Presidents Kennedy and Johnson, and was one of the founders of our organization. So our affiliation with the Udall family goes back decades and is one we truly cherish. Welcome you both this evening. We are excited to have you here to discuss some of the most pressing conservation issues of our time. Terry?
Thank you, Joanna. And Senator Udall, it's wonderful to see you. I have so many questions for you. And first of all, I just want to tell you how much I appreciate you. I feel like this is an extended conversation from the one we had last fall at Collected Works. And I really want to honor your family, your father, who started the Santa Fe Conservation Trust, and this dinner that is in his name. How are you, first of all?
I'm doing just great. Doing just great. And I just want to say, you call me Tom. That's what we usually, and we talk with each other. I've always urged you to do that. So you can certainly do that if you can bring yourself to it in this conversation we're going to have.
Thank you, Tom. And you already know I adopt you as our senator, or I'm one of your constituents in the American West. So thank you, Tom. Where are you? And I don't just mean in Washington, D.C., but I'd love to know your state of mind, as well as your beloved state of New Mexico in these past really 6 months as we have faced this planetary pause.
Well, I would first of all say that I'm just very, very troubled by what I see our country doing in terms of this pandemic, how we're addressing it, how the president has really decided to give up leadership on the national stage and give it over to the states. He feels that's a better political move for him. And we really need the federal government, and we need the president and a strong federal strategy. So that's very disappointing, and I'm right in the middle of it. But the other thing that I've seen, which is really a counter to all of that, and you remember we last talked in the fall when your book Erosion came out, and Erosion's dealing with all the issues we're going to talk about tonight. We were in a place where what was about to happen, the president, I think after our conversation, was impeached by the House and tried by the Senate. Then in March, we had this pandemic. Well, it started much earlier. As we know, somebody biting into an endangered species in China shut down the world come the first of the year. And here we are a few months from Black Lives Matter and what happened with George Floyd. And you know, one of the things I take away from it is, and this is where I am, is this is very positive. This is something is happening. And you know, you hear people say, well, let's get back to normal. Actually, what's being exposed is so broad and it's so devastating for people to look at that I think people understand that we cannot have that inequality anymore in housing, in healthcare, in all the areas, education, where our citizens are all wanting more. And so when we say get back, I'm hoping that we get back to a new normal out of this that will contain all the things that you and I love so much in terms of nature and dealing with climate change and entering a whole new era. So I'm on one hand very disappointed and disillusioned with what's happened back here in Washington, but I'm very hopeful when I look out and see the action that's been taken, some of it in the name of my good friend John Lewis, who we just had a 6 days of mourning, and I think he had some lessons for us. But Terry, one of the things I'm wondering, with all this that's happened since erosion came out, and I know how good of friends, and friends is an understatement, you and my father were, and here we're at this dinner. What in all the years that you knew him, if he was looking at your book coming out and then what's happened in this year, what lessons would we take from his life, and what would he be telling us to do now?
Tom, that just moves me to tears. You know, I think about your father. I think about when we listened to him prepare his talk for the 100th anniversary of Rachel Carson's death. Do you remember?
Yes.
And
Yeah.
how he had those notes, you know, with almost a word a page because his eyes weren't so good. I remember his optimism. I remember his generosity. I remember, I think the thing I remember most is his vision. And for me, his vision was always one of conversation, that he would talk about, as you know, how it wasn't about Republicans or Democrats or left or right, but about human beings who cared about a living, breathing democracy. And that he was so troubled by the partisanship that was happening. And so I think that he would be telling us to have those difficult conversations and to remember our humanity. And perhaps, you know, what you're saying about this is both a reckoning and an awakening at once, that we are both eroding and evolving in this moment. I feel like he would be asking us not to go back, but to go forward with what you're saying about both Black Lives Matter and the Bureau of Land Management. I think about these two, what's the word? The spirit of Black Lives Matter, the spirit of the work you and I care about with the BLM, the Bureau of Land Management, and how do we find that connective tissue of justice, not just for our species, but all species, equity for Black people, for Native people, for people of color. And I think that we are in a new place. And I think about Baldwin, I think about John Lewis, Baldwin saying that it was the writer's responsibility and the politician's responsibility to disturb, to be a critic, to be a witness. And as John Lewis, you know, told us, to be engaged in good trouble. So I think your father would be saying, let's come up with some good trouble. And I would ask you, what might that look like? And especially, Tom, with 6 months left, really, as senator, what does good trouble look like for you as you re-enter the open space of democracy as a citizen?
Well, one of the reasons that I decided almost 2 years ago, I wanted to have about a 2-year period that I could be really unleashed and do the things that I thought were very important about the biggest issues that we were facing, whether it was climate change or the endless wars that we're in, or the just the destruction we see around us of our democracy and the erosion of it, to use your word, which is such a good word when we're talking about democracy and our democratic traditions and what has happened to them. And so it has really been uplifting for me to do that. And that's what I plan to do for the rest of my life, is to be speaking out on these issues, having a voice and taking action and participating with others. And when you talk about my father, I think of the thing he said about don't get discouraged, because the big things that you're going to try to do will never be done in a lifetime. But it doesn't mean that you shouldn't do those things, that you shouldn't take action. And there was a part of Dad that was this really persistent. He just persistently was after things. He just never gave up. And you and I saw that near the end of his life. And my brother, who was a year younger than I was, we both had brothers who, my brother tried to commit suicide. My brother was mentally ill, and we discovered in my brother's papers a letter from my dad when we didn't quite know what was happening with my brother, but the whole thing that my dad was trying to say to him, you got to be persistent. You've got to just hang in there. He says, life is about ups and downs. And he says, you hit obstacles, but you've got to move through them. You've got to persevere. And so that's what we need to be doing now. And I think you do it in such a wonderful way with your work. I mean, we live in this age of uncertainty, where we don't know what's going to happen, where the world's been kind of shut down, where all the norms have been broken. And yet you're a writer who reaches down to the soul, to your soul, and to trying to connect with all of our souls. And how, Terry, where do you come out after you've come out with Erosion? I'm kind of wondering what you're working on. You don't need to tell me the name or anything, but when you see all these things that happen, where do you come out in terms of how do we deal with this? What kind of world are we in? And is there hope, really? Is there hope?
That was my question for you, you know.
My answer is yes, but I want to hear your soulful answer.
I have been, how do you even say this, Tom, organizing myself on the cycles of the moon. So like the first moon cycle from March until April, my brother, Hank, my living brother, now my only brother, contracted COVID-19, and we almost lost him. And so I was just focused on getting him here, meaning in the desert where he could heal, which we did, and worried about my father, who's 87, and then I was teaching. So that first month was really just for me finding solid ground where it didn't feel like there was much. And on one hand, it was this glory of being in this beautiful place of red rocks and ravens and watching a spring come forth. The other was the terror of, would my brother make it? Was my father safe? Are my students mentally prepared for what this is going to ask of us, which is uncertainty, not knowing where we're going. And we engage in what we called a coyote chaplaincy. And we created a chaplaincy of the arts in collaboration with the University of Utah. And it was really powerful, so that the frontline workers who don't have time to curate inspiration or to know where they might find an essay or a quote or a prayer, the students, we engaged in good work, and it was good trouble. And for me, the answer is always action, creativity, being agile, being flexible, and being present. I think the high point has been when a Say's Phoebe landed on my head. How can you not be hopeful about that? But I'm wondering where your faith and hope come from, Tom.
I would say, first of all, it's deeply rooted in the land. There's a solitude, there's solace that you gain from being out of doors. And at this time, when I'm back in Santa Fe at my home, when I fly back, I'm quarantined for 2 weeks. I'm actually a federal employee, so federal employees, the governor says are exempted, but I try to make sure, because I'm worried about my family and relatives and things, that I'm okay. And so I take off into the mountains. I do a lot of work there at the house, but I take off into the mountains, and it's rejuvenating. It's just very, very special. And I think there's a group in the Senate, the Faith and Politics group, that we meet once a week. We're now meeting on Zoom. We used to meet in person, and we would talk about things that would concern all of us. We tried very much to bring Republicans in, but we haven't had much luck. But it's some good Democratic friends that I meet with, and I think all of us feel that there's a new normal that we can get back to. So I'm focusing on that, and I really, Terry, look forward to what we can work together on. I mean, you mentioned the Bureau of Land Management. One of the big issues that's out there is the idea that we should save 30% of our land and our oceans by 2030. And then looking forward to 2050, 50%. That's what Wilson said in his book, Half Earth, as we know. And really the scientists are telling us that that's when we really have a chance of saving the earth and dealing with climate change. Because if you have nature at its strongest, it absorbs an awful lot of the carbon dioxide, and then we are able to try to really make the changes in our life that we need to make to live in a sustainable way, rather than the kind of destructive ways that we're living right now.
I love this idea of 30-30. Where did it come from, and how did you envision it underneath this umbrella of Half Earth that Wilson was talking about?
Well, the scientists, Wilson and the scientists, I think were the ones that really focused on what was happening. And part of what we're in, people should understand, is some have said, you know, how could it happen that you bite a bat in Wuhan and it shuts down the world? Well, the reality is as we encroach more and more on nature, what we end up seeing is that we are endangering ourselves because we aren't protecting nature. And protecting nature is really protecting humanity. And I don't know whether people know the term, but I know you and I know this, zoonotic diseases. These are diseases that migrate from wildlife into human beings. And they've done that in Africa, and they've done that in China. The SARS and MERS and HIV, many of these have made that transition from the animal world to the human world. And we know that that's what's responsible for what we're going through right now. And that's part of our, if we look forward and say, how do we deal with this? One of the ways is to tackle climate change, to do 30-30. And the wonderful thing for me anyway, is this isn't about just the federal government. This is a partnership where we need to partner with the rest of the nations on the planet, and the federal government partners with states and local government. As you know, the Land and Water Conservation Fund has now been permanently funded and fully funded. And so states and localities and city governments can now look forward to say, hey, there's going to be money in the budget every year. So if we want a park or a swimming pool or something where people can do things in the outdoors, we'll now have shared money where we can work together to do that. So that's pretty special. That's pretty special. And we've had these big victories in Washington where the politics and the good policy actually came together. it's a wonderful thing to see.
That's so exciting. I've got so many questions. You know, well, there's the BLM director who is a problem, right?
Yeah.
Which
Oh,
you have.
he's a serious problem. We don't
Well,
even
yeah,
need to talk
and
about him, Terry. We should just the idea of him being put forward to run the BLM after all the horrible
the
things he's done to the BLM.
and the blood quantum with Native people. I mean, we could go on and on. There's that. But here's a deeper question. You know, in this moment of equity and racism, how do we talk about public lands and tribal lands? And, you know, I've had people say, you know, you've devoted your life to public lands, but these are stolen lands. And yet I think Bears Ears is such a beautiful example of this collaboration of sacred lands with the Dene, the Navajo, the Hopi, the Zuni, and the Ute nations. But how do you talk about that, Tom? And certainly you, your father, your family, the committees that you serve on, and all of the bills you passed on behalf of Native people. How do you see that? I'm going to ask one more question overlaid. Actually, well, do
Let's
you know the
stop
writer?
there. Let's
Yeah,
stop
okay.
there because I want you to talk too, because you've written books about this and you understand Native
But
culture
I
so
really,
well. But
I
here,
think
let me
I,
answer that first question, and then we'll go on from here. The knowing how these lands have gone from native holdings, and then in the Southwest, we know about the Spanish being here. And then in the Southwest, the Anglos were only the more recent, the folks that arrived. And there was some horrible history. And we know that, and we see that with some of the statues that are coming down now. And the more and more we learn about the history. And so always we should approach this, as many people had, with these truth and reconciliation commissions where the entire community comes together and talks about where we are now, what's been the history, and how do we move forward. And that's why I was so encouraged as to what had happened under President Obama when it came to looking at southern Utah and some of the sites in southern Utah, and that expansion of Escalante Grand Staircase and Bears Ears were true collaboration, working with Native American tribes. It had gone on for many, many years, and here you had tribes that had conflict with each other who came together with all the other stakeholders and worked out a resolution. And now with his pen, the president has thrown that out. It's become a very contentious issue. I don't think he has the legal authority to do it. It's being challenged in the court, and we'll see how that comes out. But I think the Antiquities Act was meant as a statute for the president to act and to do things, and not undo what other presidents have done.
and how do you see, Tom, public lands as inclusive lands? As, you know, what's the intersection between the BLM and the BLM?
Well, to me, when you look at the public lands that the nation has now, which are all over the United States, and this is taking all the public lands, and there are all these treasures and jewels in various places that are visited by people from all around the world. And we know each of those public lands have had different histories, and they have had different conflicts that have gone on. But the way we move forward is we all move forward together. And that's why I think it's so important that we always, when we talk about a new action, to say, bring the stakeholders together, have hearings, have public hearings. Congress, in many cases, has laid the public groundwork when it has taken action. President has done the same thing. I remember President Obama sent his cabinet secretary and other people out and visited and said, what's the best thing to do here? They negotiated with Native Americans, and then they made decisions based on that. And that's really the best way to move forward, I believe. And
And
you have had, Terry, you have had such experience and passion in terms of writing about Native American culture and writing about the traditions. What is it, Terry, that you think is our lesson or lessons and from their traditions and things that they were doing here in America before any outsiders were here?
I mean, I keep thinking about that, and Bears Ears has been a great lesson for me as a white conservationist, to see the collaboration, to begin to understand what it means to be a good ally, and to listen. That has been really important to me, and to see that Willie Gray Eyes is now on the county commission, a resident of Navajo Mountain, who I have to say, those in Blanding, Utah said that it was an illegitimate election. So, I've watched racism in my own home state and what that looks like, and what courage someone like Willie Gray Eyes has had to fight that, to say, I too have a place at this table. So I think we've all learned a lot in Utah. And I hope that my senator and relative, Mitt Romney, can come to understand what public lands means and supports them. I was interested that he was not on the letter that you and many Western senators wrote in terms of the proposed director of the BLM. I think about what Obama did with Cesar Chavez National Monument, and to look at what La Paz, created in terms of boycotts and good trouble. I think about Harriet Tubman, that national monument. I think about the inclusivity of what President Obama brought forth in our national parks and monuments. And I think that's a template. But I'm also really interested in uncomfortable ideas. And there's a writer, David Truer, who is also Ojibwe, and he's writing an article for The Atlantic. And he is saying there's so much discussion about reparations, both for Black people and what about for Native people? And he's advocating, Tom, that all the national parks go back into the stewardship of Native people, of Indigenous people. And I'm wondering, how do you feel about that? What would that look like if our national parks were returned to Native people? Yosemite, Grand Canyon, Bears Ears, Yellowstone, Grand Teton. I mean, can you imagine that?
Yeah, there are some wonderful Native writers and Native thinkers that are now participating in a way they've never done in the past. I was on a panel the other day with the Wilderness Society, and Jim Inote from the Zuni tribe was talking about the idea of joint management, which is very similar to what you're talking about, which Bruce Babbitt did in a number of the Western parks. Many times it was the creation of a new monument or a park on BLM lands, or it was expanding an area and then moving into the area of joint management, especially where there was a real tradition and there were sacred lands and a lot of overlap between how these tribes lived there in the past and then where they're living now. And so once again, I mean, I'm the vice chairman of the Senate Indian Affairs Committee. Much of the jurisdiction on public lands is over in the Energy and Natural Resources. And so if we're going to act on this in the Congress, we need a lot of collaboration between the committees. But part of my life's work has been always to try to listen to the tribes, to see what the tribes want to do and see where they want to head. And in many cases, going back to what my father did, and then eventually it was put into place with Richard Nixon. Fred Harris from New Mexico also worked on this, and that's Blue Lake being given back Forest Service land being given back to the Taos Pueblo. This was an extremely sacred lake to them. They had gone every year, regardless of what the status of the land. And eventually, it took a lot of time. It took a lot of work. Everybody needed to understand where everybody else was coming from. But boy, it got done. It got done. And it's still today that is looked at in Indian country in a very special way. So we have seen a wonderful growth in terms of ideas and working together. But the core is respecting sovereignty, understanding the trust and treaty responsibility, and then any action the federal government takes should be in very close consultation with tribes. And those are kind of my principles that I always bring to the table at the committee and when we deal with Native American issues. The one other thing I'd like to mention is, as you know, my father and my uncle, a good chunk of their work was on Native American issues, and the Udall Foundation was set up in their name to continue internships and scholarships for Native American youth to continue work in environment and healthcare and Native leadership, which has been a real inspiration for me working with them, and I know I will continue with them for a long time.
I mean, it really feels like that is one of the Udall legacies. And Blue Lake is a beautiful example. And, you know, you speak about your father. I so wish he was here on Zoom with us, you know, and just, you know, Stuart, can you imagine hearings in Congress on reparations with national parks and Native people, you know, and I think about Glacier and the Blackfeet and conversations that have been going on there. I don't know, Tom, I just feel like right now, anything is possible. And I am so ready to give up whatever power I have had as a white person to really say it is our time now to listen. And when you ask about, you know, what I have learned from Native people, what I'm continuing to learn, is that it's all interconnected, you know, and that we do have a relationship with the land and water and sky and beings. And I just keep thinking of Jonah Yellowman when he says, we're not protecting bears' ears for our people, but for all people. And I think, you know, one of the things that this planetary pause, it's brought us all home. It's brought us to our knees. There's no place to hide. There's no distractions. Brooke and I have seen each other more in the last 6 months than 45 years, you know, and I just feel like it's all brand new. And it's about creativity and being flexible. And it's humbling and it's hard. And I don't have any answers. I just want to listen and to help create something different. And I feel like that's what you've been doing, especially Tom, in these last 2 years. I've watched the bills you've been passing and the energy you've given to Native people, to public lands, to education, to health. And I feel like all of us who are listening right now, you know, in this gathering in your father's name, really want to thank you for who you are, what you stand for, the spirituality you bring, and the integrity you hold. And I would be remiss if I didn't say, I do hope there might be a future as the next Secretary of Interior. And I know I'm not alone in that. But perhaps we could open this up for some questions.
Yeah, let's do that. Let's have a couple of questions. I know this dinner, they love to do a number of things. And so, Joanna, help us with a few questions. I know you've consulted members of the Santa Fe Conservation Trust, and let's hear what they have to say.
Well, first, let me say thank you to you both for such an inspirational conversation that's also filled with hope. It was very good to hear your views on so many issues, but also how to what we can do about it and how we can approach our future with hope in our heart. So thank you for that. And we do have some questions, although y'all covered a lot of ground and touched on a lot of topics. But because I actually have a personal history on also helping to get the Land and Water Conservation Fund passed, you know, because it took a village to get that done, but we so appreciate what leaders like yourself, Senator, did in Congress to get that finally accomplished. I want to mention it because one question we have for you, because we work on this in our community conservation initiatives within the trust, but many other groups are as well across the country, and that is that during this COVID pandemic, people have been flocking to the outdoors. Right here in Santa Fe County, but on our national forest BLM lands, our trails are seeing more use than ever. And we know that it's very important to have nature be a part of the healing and well-being of people during this particular time. So during the pandemic, as we look at the use on our local, state, and federal parks and other public lands, many of programs of which, or facilities of which, had previously been funded by the Land and Water Conservation Fund and hopefully will be in the future. Can you, Senator, talk about the Great American Outdoors Act and how it can address people's needs to be outdoors, but also, as we're trying to focus on here locally and in the state, is how do we create more equitable access to these outdoors so that people enjoy the health and well-being that can come from that experience?
Yeah, well, that's Joanna, that's a great question. And let me just first of all, thank you for your leadership on this wonderful conservation trust and what you've done. I mean, everybody should know, and anybody that watches this, that Santa Fe Conservation Trust has preserved many, many acres of land around Santa Fe with a real idea as to making the community of Santa Fe more livable by having trails and designated areas that everybody can enjoy themselves and find some peace and some solace. So it's tremendously important that we work together for the parks, which is America's greatest idea and that we love. We're loving these parks to death. And part of what the Great American Outdoors Act does is deal with the maintenance issue that is now with the national parks. We have parks in New Mexico that are famous all around the world and people visit here. Carlsbad, Bandelier, Chaco, and their infrastructure is deteriorating. They need additional funds, and it's just absolutely crucial that we get those funds to them. It's in this bill, and it'll do it. In addition to the Land and Water Conservation funding, billions of dollars over a 5-year period to start dealing with the maintenance issue, which is an issue that's been hanging around for a long, long time. So we're looking forward to doing that, and we're looking forward to whatever it is in New Mexico that the local communities want to do, working with the federal government to move forward with this 30-30 proposal to find additional parks and open space and monuments where people want to enjoy the outdoors. And we're going to be open for business come the first of the year. So looking forward to it.
As are we all. Thank you very much, Senator. Terry, I could turn to you with a similar question in regard to talking about environmental justice, but since we're talking about the outdoors and conservation, a little bit more specifically about equitable access to the outdoors. We here at the Conservation Trust have started a community conservation program to reach out to all demographics in our service territory to try to provide programming, information, education, outdoor activities for a wide array of citizens. And when we look locally, but at the state and regional and national level, what kind of advice can you give us as a local trust, but also to other nonprofits and others working, and state governments actually, and county governments working on this issue, to help us understand what equitable access means and what some ideas are that you might have, Terry, about how we achieve that. What kind of actions would you like to see groups and governments taking to help with that?
It's a great question, Joanna. One thing I would love to see is more money being given to the National Parks Interpretive Program. It's been cut severely. And for many people, I worked for the Park Service when I was younger, that's where they get their education. That may be the first time they've seen a night sky of stars. And so I think to have allocated funds for environmental education within the National Park Service. I think the pandemic has brought us all home. And for me personally, I think it's really important to look at the school systems and do we have environmental education programs in place? Is science being taught in an effective way? And field trips. I think it's really important that for communities such as Moab or Santa Fe or Jackson, Wyoming, or, we could name every bedroom community or community adjacent to a national park in the country. Can they have partnerships with the schools and with local land trusts such as yourself to make each child a gift, really, a community gift, that they will visit a national park? In Moab, when I was working with the sixth graders, 70% of our students had never been to Arches National Park. That is literally a stone's throw away from the elementary school. Why? Because they didn't have the money to pay for the entrance fee. And so we were able to get that waived. Certainly, Sally Jewell, the wonderful program of fourth graders being able to have access to the park. But we made part of the curriculum a field guide to the Southwest, a field guide to Canyon Country at sixth grade. They get that book. They use that book in an interdisciplinary way of all subjects. And then they get to take that book and identify these plants, animals, geology in Arches National Park. So I think creativity in the educational system through the parks, through local trusts, and the school boards themselves. That's one idea.
Joanna, the other thing that Terry reminds me of is right outside of Albuquerque is one of our newest recreation areas, the Valles del Oro National Recreation Area and Monument. And it's a wonderful place that's right on the edge of Albuquerque. And so we have many youngsters. The last time I was down there, I think the majority of the young people were Hispanic who hadn't had an opportunity to go to a park. This is an area that's on the flight migration of all the birds from Canada to Mexico, both in the winters and summers. And it's just a great opportunity to be there, to be on the land. And that's the kind of thing we can do when we've envisioned full funding of the Land and Water Conservation Fund and allowing communities to plan and look ahead and say, how do we create a park that'll make this community much more livable and open it up for young people to be in the wilderness? That's how Central Park was created. Everybody sees Central Park being surrounded on all sides. It was actually a visionary decision of Central Park there in New York, where they looked out on land that they didn't believe had much hope for, but people had a vision and they purchased it. And now you look at Central Park and it's one of the examples all around the world of how you can make urban life very livable. So we now have an opportunity to do that with this new Land and Water Conservation Fund, fully funded.
Well, thank you very much, Senator, for bringing up the Valle del Oro, because it is one of the nation's first urban federal wildlife refuge. It's an excellent example. And thank you, Terry, for those very practical observations and suggestions about how we can work on community conservation and reaching out to all sectors of our citizens to get them outdoors. I have one last question, and I'm going to go ahead and make it kind of local, Senator, because many of us in New Mexico are concerned about this. Anyone who's ever visited Chaco Canyon has got to be just overwhelmed with the magnificence of these ancient structures and this sacred place and all the unknown and history there that just still has us mystified. So bringing it home to New Mexico and to a national jewel that a lot of us are concerned about, but also being cognizant of the fact that here in New Mexico, as I know you're well aware, we are dependent on the oil and gas industry for a big part of our state budget, but also for jobs and community development and many, many things. And so when it comes to the delicate balance between oil and gas revenues impacting New Mexico's economy versus our need to preserve so many of our most valued historical and cultural significant sites. What are some of your thoughts about that? I know you've worked hard on these issues. What best determines who and how these challenges should be addressed? And do you see a win-win scenario in how, just focusing on Chaco Canyon as an example, we should be managing these needs?
Yeah, and raising Chaco is a great example, because you both you have oil and gas in the region. And by the way, the most significant statistic is that in that area, 90% of those lands have already been leased for oil and gas development and exploration. So the agreement that was reached by local tribes, stakeholders, and others over 2 administrations and 2 different presidents was to put a 10-mile buffer around Chaco Canyon. And it's only late into this administration that they're now trying to violate that. The first secretary told me over and over again, you know, we're going to protect the 10-mile buffer, but now the second one seems to see it differently. So we were reaching a good balance there. All the stakeholders felt good about this. And then we took the extra step, and this is the issue that Terry is passionate about and that she raised. We took the step to say to Native American tribes, from the time Chaco was established in the early 1900s, everything that's happened and everything we know now, because a lot more has been discovered about the cultures in the area. What would you like to be done to take a look at Greater Chaco? And they said, you know, we would like to participate in a study together with the federal departments that have responsibility for this. If you could get us some money and we could work through a process, a consultation. And we got an extra $1 million in the appropriation cycle. It was from my subcommittee, and I worked very closely with the Republican chairman and others to make sure that we could get the resources so this could be done. And the next thing we know, we've launched that in order to allow all of the tribes to then participate and say, has it changed over time and what needs to be done now? And so it's a great example of win-win if we all work together. The problem is with this administration is the backtracking that occurs, where they decide from pressure, and I think it's pressure from the very powerful interest, to go in another direction from what they first decided to protect Chaco and keep a 10-mile buffer. So we're back to legislating. We're going to get it done in legislation. But thank you, and thank you to everybody this evening, and it's great being with all of you, and I always am thankful for the founders of this wonderful trust, my father being one of them, and what you have done for our community, because you've made it much, much more livable.
Well, thank you so much. But clearly, between the two of you, we would love to continue this conversation all night. And of course, we wish we could. We can't. We need to let you both go. But thank you very much, Terry, for your time and energy in preparing for this evening's conversation and the wonderful questions you asked of our wonderful senator, and vice versa, Senator. You're a very good interviewer yourself. So thank you so much for contributing to the success of tonight's event. We do feel we do very meaningful work here in our community and in our service territory. And we couldn't do it if we didn't have the support of the people joining us tonight. Likewise, the support of such thoughtful and active people like yourselves. So thank you so much, and our best to both of you. Please stay healthy and safe, and we'll look forward to touching base with you both again soon.
Thank you, Terry and Joanna. Thank you.
Thank you,
Good
Tom.
night, everyone.